in another way, have the higher demand to open. By doing that, we look at the macro considerations. And I've termed that as your capacity and your demand. Your capacity for those facilities, so in other words, how many people can fit in a specific amenity, and your demand, how many people want that amenity to open. And if we look at capacity, that's a known factor. So again, right from the Government of Ontario website, we know that right now, no more than 10 people can congregate in a given space. And that means we know that none of the facilities that we have in a condominium should have more than 10 people in them at a time. So in other words, if you're looking at which facilities to open and which to keep closed, if you consider a party room, for example, it might be better served that we look at opening a guest suite where you have 1 or 2 people versus a party room where some people might expect to invite 10, 15, 30 people to a party. We obviously don't want that. We need to make sure that the facilities we open are governed appropriately and we're not taking any undue risk. So opening facilities that you can limit the number of people in and focusing our attention on those facilities is a more responsible approach, at least to start. So capacity is a pretty straightforward item. What's a little more unclear is the demand. And I call this an unknown factor simply because every condominium corporation is different. The demographic of every corporation is different. The reciprocal agreements and the type of amenities for every condo is different. So if you're condo TSCC 123, you might have a public pool, you might have a gym, you might have a library, and the demographic of your residents might have a very high demand to opening that gym. But if you're just across the street from that condo corporation and you have a property that has a high population of seniors and they've got a billiards room and a racquetball court, you might want to ask yourself, what's the facility that's in greater demand? I think the answer is pretty obvious. We're going to open the billiards room before the racquetball room. But these are things that we want to consider when we're making a plan to determine which facilities open first. The last point on this slide is the shared facilities. Not everybody has complex shared facilities agreements and relationships with other condo corporations. But for those of you that do, you have an extra layer of consideration you'll need when you're opening facilities. If you have amenities that have shared facilities and multiple staff members, you're going to have to take that into consideration to determine the complexity of the facilities that you want to open. Some facilities will be a lot easier to open than others, and so we need to take that into consideration when we're developing this plan. So in other words, I've referred to this many times, creating a plan. That is the purpose of this conversation. How do we create a plan that opens these amenities safely for the benefit of everybody? And so if we've identified which amenities we want to open, and again, that's going to be different for each and every one of you, we have to think about what the micro considerations are. So let's say that you have 10 amenities in your condominium corporation. You've identified 5 that you want to open right away. Maybe there's another 5 that you're going to open a couple months from now. Those 5 that you want to open right away, we have to understand how we're going to monitor those amenities, how we're going to have responsible ownership of them. And that includes the booking methods of those facilities, the access control to and from those amenities, all the social distancing measures inside of them, the cleaning of those spaces, and finally the signage. So I'm going to take you through a couple of these areas to give some examples and better understand how we can have the greatest sense of control over these areas. So the first is the booking method. If you're opening, let's say, your gym, I'll use that as an example, you might want to resume your regular booking methods. For a gym, that might simply be fobbing into your gym and doing your workout and leaving. But you might see the risk there with what's going on in the world. Instead, we might want to create a booking by appointment only system, in which case you might have a resident call in to book an appointment to use the gym, or make a reservation to use the gym on some sort of application, or seeing your concierge or your manager in person to do so. And that gives you the ability to create a reservation policy or a reservation agreement. Think of that as like you would do a party room booking or a guest suite booking, where you have specific terms that your resident or occupant must agree to use the facility. If they sign an agreement allowing them or acknowledging that they have a specific right to use the facility, but they also waive a right to use that facility, it gives you a little greater sense of control over the area. So for example, if someone's using the gym and they're not observing social distancing, or they're not following some sort of instruction that you've laid out in a policy, then you have the right to excuse them from that facility. And many documents may already have language such as that, but creating a reservation or modifying your booking methods to give you a little bit of greater control is just an extra layer of protection that you can use. So this is just something to consider if you're going to be opening your facilities, how you're going to conduct the booking of those amenities, and whether you want to restrict the booking to give you greater control. The second item is the access control. How are you going to actually physically determine that control or enforce it? So in the past, where we use this example as a gym, someone might just fob into the gym and do their workout. Now, perhaps you might have them escorted by your security or your superintendent. You might have the fobs locked during certain hours, or when it's at capacity, change the protocol to enter the facility. Your security cameras will help you monitor the number of people that are in a facility at a given time, making sure that it doesn't exceed that 10-person limit. And then finally, the waivers of liability, which I mentioned earlier in a reservation agreement, I know is a bit of a hot topic, and perhaps Deborah can speak to that a little bit later from a legal perspective, but it gives you a little bit of sense of peace of mind that you can indemnify the corporation and the board from opening these spaces being at risk that someone might, knock on wood, get sick and want to sue the corporation because they use the facility. The next is the social distancing measures. So if we use a different example this time and talk about pools, if we look at a pool, there's a lot of different moving parts in a pool's facility. We've got locker rooms, a pool deck, a whirlpool. Some might even have a sauna, and they all tie together. So it's not as simple as just, hey, sign this agreement, you're ready to go enter the facility and use it. We've got to ensure that there are social distancing measures in place in those facilities. So maybe we need stickers on the floor to ensure that people know they have to stay 6 feet apart. Maybe there are physical barriers that need to be installed in those facilities to keep people at that safe distance. Whatever the case may be, whichever the amenity that you were looking at, there are unique circumstances that we need to plan for before we just open those facilities up. So this is something you can speak to your trades about. Your company will have its own policies if you're a property manager, or if you're a board member, ask the company what their policies are. And then when you create this plan, you have a better sense of control again over how you're going to monitor the use of the facility. When we talk about outdoor pools, here's a little bit of information that I've pulled from the Government of Ontario website as well. So circling back to what I said before, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. If the government already has specific guidelines around the use of outdoor public pools, we can use that in condominiums just as well. And so you'll see how complicated and complex this is when you read through some of these items. You know, it's important that we clean and sanitize, disinfect all of these areas and the equipment servicing these areas. So in a gym or a pool, that's quite complicated, and it takes quite a degree of work to keep those areas clean. So this is just an example of some of the considerations you'll need to make before opening a space. When we talk about the cleaning and sanitization, this also has a few layers. If we're going to perform a cleaning before or after the use of an amenity, then we're going to need to be sure that we have the cleaning products and the cleaning staff to do so. It's going to determine what the hours of operation for those facilities are if we're going to have cleaners in those areas performing a clean before or after the use. And that will also relate to how you're going to do your booking. If it's a free-for-all and anyone can go inside of the amenity without control, you're going to have less control over cleaning the space than you would if you had a booking for an hour and then a cleaner comes in and disinfects after the fact. Having sanitizers provided, installed, whether they're wipes or gel sanitizers for the benefit of the residents, is always a good idea, even if it's just for peace of mind, but it might take some of the pressure off of the cleaners. And when we're talking about cleaners, another thing to consider is the fact that during this last 3 months, if you have kept your amenities closed, those cleaners have been taking time out of their day to clean high traffic areas, like your lobbies, your mail rooms, and your elevators. If now you're opening all of your amenities or a selection of those amenities, your cleaner's time will now be spent on those areas, and it will detract from the time that they're taking to clean other areas of the building. So what does this mean? Well, it means that you may have to pay additional costs for cleaning, whether it's in additional hours or additional staff, or you may have to sacrifice their time cleaning other areas so that they can clean the amenities. Either way, it's a complex conversation that you're going to need to plan for. The last thing I'll talk about is signage. And this is really just a precautionary measure, having some sort of signage on your amenities so that we can show owners and residents that management and the board has taken a proactive approach. We're not just opening these facilities and letting anybody come in there. We're doing our part to educate people. And while we can't guarantee that people using these facilities won't get sick, we can do our best to educate them and control the situation as best as possible to limit the transmission of COVID. So what's the takeaway? Well, the takeaway is it's complicated. As you can appreciate, every property is different, every board is different, the demographic of every building is different. And so it's not simple for us to sit here and say, this is what you should do, follow A, B, and C, and you'll have a streamlined process when opening your facility. It's going to take a lot of planning, a lot of discussion with your board and with your senior management personnel to create a plan that's both responsible and safe for the residents and for management and the board. And when you create that plan, you must be responsive and flexible. Because as we know, things change day to day, week to week with this situation. And what the regulations were yesterday might not be what they are tomorrow. So in order to create some sort of plan, we've got to be responsive and adaptable to having that plan shift from time to time. And these are just some of the basic things we need to consider when opening these facilities. I won't take up any more time. I know the hour goes by pretty quick, and I talk pretty fast, but hopefully you've all garnered some important information here. And if not, you can refer to the recording and circle back in your notes. And thank you for your time. Hopefully Deborah can enlighten us with some of the legal issues surrounding the opening and use of facilities in these condos.
Thank you very much, Nick, and hello to everyone participating in this webinar. I can safely say, I think I try not to speak for panels, but I think I can safely say that we all thought that this webinar was timely and certainly important given the stage of things that currently exist in the province. Specifically, as the province continues to reopen and as the restrictions associated with the pandemic are lifted and we emerge from lockdown, there are a number of legal issues related to keeping our condominium community safe. And it's my hope in the brief time that I have to speak with you today, it's my hope to address just some of those. I've tried to focus on the more hot button type issues, but I will focus on those so that we can talk through some of the legal implications. So the first thing that many condominium boards would like to know is, can we close the amenities? Residents are expecting to enjoy them, owners are paying for them. Is it legal to close the amenities? And in one word, I'm just going to short circuit it and make it very simple. Yes. You might hear a little bit of frustration in my answer, and it's because to this day, I continue to get letters from owners or their council who threaten certain boards with legal action because certain amenities have remained closed, or for imposing restrictions that are broader than those imposed by the provincial government. So specifically, they're asking for access to the fitness room for various reasons, access to the pool because of the heat wave we've been having, or they want in-person showings of their unit because their unit's up for sale, and the list goes on. But by and large, I can say that the restrictions that have been placed by condominium corporations have generally been reasonable and with a view to protect the health and safety of the residents. So some questions our law firm has been receiving. If the province allows pools to reopen, does that mean that our particular condo has to also reopen the pool? And the answer is no. The condominium reopening schedule does not have to mirror what is happening at the provincial level. It can be more restrictive. because maybe in your community you have a vulnerable population, so sick or elderly persons with comorbidities. Or maybe in your particular community you have a multi-level building and hundreds of units, so you've got a very dense population in a smaller space. Or maybe you have a number of active COVID cases. So there are a number of other factors that are going to affect whether or not you should reopen. Nick has alluded to some of those. But what I want to focus on is the legal authority, for keeping the amenities closed or imposing restrictions when the condominium documents specifically reference the use and enjoyment of certain amenities. So, and this is just going to be very, very fast. The first one is Section 17 of the Condominium Act, which says that the corporation is tasked with managing the property. It has a general power under that section. And then Section 117 of the Condo Act, many of you are going to be familiar with this provision, and I've highlighted the important wording there, is that the Act prohibits the existence of a condition or the carrying on of an activity in the unit or common elements where it is likely to cause injury to a person's health. And that's summarizing what the section says, but obviously to the extent that there is an increased risk of the virus exposure in the condominium community, that falls plainly within the section of 117. And then the other section is under a completely different act, the Occupiers Liability Act. Many of you know this act, and under this legislation, the corporation is required to keep people safe from harm when they enter and attend upon the property, the condominium property. So when you add all of those statutory obligations together, the requirement to manage the property and assets, the requirement to stop any activity which is likely to cause injury to an individual, and the requirement to keep the property safe, then you've got a constellation of obligations that allow the corporation to impose restrictions on access to the common elements, and that include shutting down the amenities and not allowing them to reopen until such time that it is safe. So let's say the board has decided to reopen an amenity. And I should add, I agree with Nick that at this time the board should really open an amenity area where physical distancing measures can be maintained, particularly given the news yesterday that suggests that the virus can be airborne. And we don't know if that's true yet, but there's some talk of that. So then the question becomes, can the corporation screen visitors who are coming into the amenity? And the answer is yes. And if those visitors screen positive or they refuse to submit to screening, then the corporation should be denying them entry. Now, in the spirit of transparency, I should tell you that not every lawyer in our community agrees with this. So I'm aware of at least one condominium law firm that has discouraged visitor screening. And they've done that on the basis, I think, that the corporation incurs some liability if it takes this task on. And what happens, for example, if somebody falls through the cracks and they've missed it because they've undertaken the screening. In our view, when I say our view, I mean our firm's view, the failure to screen incoming persons to the amenities also may attract liability and potentially more so. So in our view, it is reasonable to screen visitors, and in fact, there may be a positive obligation given all the legislative pieces that I've shared with you just earlier. The board should also consider whether it has the capacity to maintain a record of visitors, and that's to assist with public health contact tracing. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about that in a few minutes. You know, not every corporation is in the position to do that, but you should consider it if you can. And many of you will have seen the type of screening questions that are asked. Here's just an example of 3, and it's not meant to be exhaustive in any way. It's just 3 potential questions. So you'll see they focus on 1, whether the person is displaying any symptoms associated with COVID-19, 2, whether they've come into contact with any person who's displayed symptoms, or 3, whether they've come into contact with anybody who has had a confirmed case. And unless they can confirm that, then the suggestion is that they're placing your property, your amenity, and your residents at risk, and they should be denied entry. Nick, in his comments just earlier, spoke about a potential waiver. And the other thing, of course, a corporation should consider in order to limit liability is whether they should be getting any visitors or residents of the amenity to sign either an acknowledgement or a waiver. And what is the difference? So an acknowledgement confirms that the person recognizes there is always a risk of contracting the virus on the premises. So here on your screen in front of you, you see the example of an acknowledgement, very simple. A waiver, on the other hand, purports to release the corporation from liability if the person does in fact contract the virus. So one of the things that you need to consider is whether or not you're going to get your visitors and residents to sign this. The other thing is you can collapse these two, an acknowledgement and a waiver, and have this on the door to every amenity area. So Nick referred just earlier to signage. Well, there would be a sign that says something very similar to what you see in this waiver. By entering the common element area, you assume all risks. Is it foolproof? Who knows? Nobody's really tested it in circumstances that involve a pandemic, but in my view, it's better to have some signage than none at all. The other really hot topic at present is face masks. And I was just speaking to the panel before we went live, and it's so interesting to me that when this pandemic first hit Canada in March, as you all know, there wasn't widespread promotion of face masks by public health. In fact, we were being told the very opposite, that wearing face masks could in fact be detrimental because you would touch the face masks and then potentially touch other surfaces. And now, of course, they are widely seen as the most effective way of reducing transmission of the virus because they inhibit the physical spread of droplets that are released into the air when a person either talks, coughs, sneezes, or breathes. Now, consistent with that, several cities have now passed bylaws making mask wearing mandatory in indoor public spaces. And coincidentally, on the very day of our webinar, Toronto's bylaw came into effect today. But just a quick note on that, the Toronto bylaw contemplates that establishments that are covered include common areas of hotels, motels, and other short-term rentals such as lobbies, elevators, meeting rooms, or other common use facilities. No mention of condominiums. So what can I tell you about that? While condominiums are not specifically mentioned in the bylaw, many areas applicable in the condominium setting are mentioned. So for example, indoor recreational facilities, gyms, swimming pools, common areas for short-term rentals, so lobbies, elevators, and meeting rooms. All of those apply to condos. So while the bylaw does not give a condominium corporation specific authority to require masks in the interior common elements, and likely doesn't apply to condominiums unless you're a commercial condominium, then every board should really consider whether nonetheless to make mask wearing mandatory, because the considerations are the same, and you're going to be concerned about your interior common elements, the lobbies, the hallways, the elevators, the mailbox rooms, all of that. So we have been asked, I suppose, in the last 7 days, that I think the most popular question is, can you require that visitors wear masks when they are in the interior common elements? The answer is yes, you can. Can you require that residents, people who are living in the condominium community, can they be required to wear face masks when they're in the common elements? I think there may be some divergence in the condo community on this. I'm not sure. Our opinion is yes, you can, for all of the reasons that I mentioned before when I cited the legislation, but also Section 58 of the Condominium Act says that you can have reasonable rules that promote the safety, security, and welfare of owners, and that prevent unreasonable interference with the use and enjoyment of common elements. So in our view, that fits squarely. And the best mechanism for enforcement really is a rule, because if you adopt it as a policy, as we all know, that's not enforceable by way of court application. So you might want to consider passing a rule for mandatory face masks. Last thing I want to cover is what do you do when a resident has COVID-19? We had some very early questions when the pandemic first broke about whether corporations should be, first of all, notifying all the residents in the building that they had a positive case, and should they be identifying the person who tested positive so that people could take precautions, because doesn't health and safety eclipse privacy? That was the early discussion. But I think it's important in answering this question to understand the general process that takes place with public health. So what will happen is when a person is tested for COVID-19, either at an assessment center or by their healthcare provider, that sample will be sent to the lab and public health will be notified. That's how we keep getting this data. You know how on a daily basis you can Google, current COVID cases in Ontario? This is how we get the data. Public health is kept informed. So if there is a positive COVID-19 diagnosis, public health knows about it. They've been advised. And then what public health will do is they will begin an investigation to interview the person who has tested positive and to determine where they may have gotten the virus and identify their close contacts. Now, what's important to mention about the close contacts is we've had so many people say, well, if you live in a building, clearly that's a close contact because you're sharing common elements in similar space. Not from the perspective of public health, and not to date. Maybe that will change. But close contacts do not necessarily include persons who are living with you in the same condominium community. Up to this point, the concern has been people with whom you have not physical distance, or people with whom you might have been speaking. And again, it's back to that theory about the virus not spreading through the air through osmosis, but through droplets and what have you. So because the spread was generally understood to be through close contacts and droplets, other people in your community were not considered close contacts and still are not. So public health is not suggesting for a minute that when somebody tests positive for COVID, that everybody in the building be alerted. Here's what we would recommend. We recommend that you send a letter to all of the residents indicating that there has been a positive diagnosis for one of the residents, that you don't name the person, that you don't name their unit, that you don't name their floor. If you are in a condominium community with several buildings, you might want to think about naming what building it is, just for transparency's sake. But there's no requirement, and in fact, we would discourage actually naming unit numbers and floors and what have you. What we do suggest you do, though, is that you do send a letter, private and confidential, to the person who has tested positive. So, and this is to limit liability, so that you remind them of their obligations to quarantine for 14 days and only to leave their unit in circumstances where it is an emergency. So, not unlike Nick, my takeaway revolves around the fact that this pandemic is really constantly evolving. Look at the new research that they're looking to uncover about how the virus can infect people, whether it can be airborne or just through droplets. So what I've done is I've attempted to provide you with some general guideposts, but the situation really is fact specific and condo unique. And you're going to have to consult with your own legal counsel on how best to proceed on all the matters I've discussed, quite frankly. I was about to say thank you for your attention, but you know how the language during COVID-19 has really evolved and developed. So people don't really say goodbye anymore. They say, stay safe or crush the curve. I saw one I really liked the other day, and I think I'll share it with you. Stay negative, meaning stay COVID-19 negative, but remain positive. So to all you out there, stay negative and remain positive.
Thanks, Deborah. I'll move on now, and very informative. So we thought to sort of finish the presentation off, we'll take a quick look at what we've seen and what we've learned so far to help people, particularly managers and board members, through making the difficult decisions that we see coming forward. So the impact of having COVID in a condominium, obviously it impacts condominium living more so than a lot of other living arrangements, because we do see, particularly in the GTA, many families living in close proximity with shared common areas, shared hallways, shared access points, shared elevators, notwithstanding all of the amenity discussion that Nicholas brought in. So we've seen closed amenities, limits on elevator occupancies. We're seeing an increase in spending on cleaning supplies, cleaning areas such as elevators, elevator buttons, frequent access points, things like that. We're seeing an increase in spending on cleaning products, personal protection equipment, on staff in some case. There's a little visitor. We're seeing modifications to concierge desks, where sometimes you have to put screens in to assist with keeping your front desk attendants safe. We're seeing, obviously, anyone who has a front desk or concierge desk is seeing an increase in the number of deliveries and packages and foot traffic to buildings. We're seeing more residents working from home, so they're being in their suites more often. And certainly we are seeing a reduction in visitors, as everyone is trying to stay home as much as possible. And what we've really found is the boards are facing some very difficult decisions, particularly around forming and updating policies, and as Deborah said, implementing rules. And the managers as well are tasked with some difficulty in putting these rules in place. So for the future, obviously the preparation is key. You absolutely need to have a plan, and you need to make sure that you really, once you've established that plan, you're going to have to work on communicating it. So the difficulty with creating the plan is that boards right now and the condominiums are seeing more costs that are being incurred. We've got to spend more money on sanitizer and cleaning products and potentially more labor to keep the areas safe and clean. But at the same time, some residents may be saying, hey, can we look at reducing our costs? Can we look at reducing our fees? Because right now I may not be working, or I'm working on a reduced income basis. So it's a very difficult balance to keep. So what we're suggesting to boards is that they should have a communication platform in place and a plan to ensure the community is informed. There's lots going on. There's lots of decisions. There's lots of obstacles that need to be overcome. And as this is constantly evolving and being very fluid, you need a method in which residents can expect sort of some regular, consistent communication. Under normal circumstances, when you are making these major decisions, if you were to say, hey, we're thinking of closing the pool, you might have an owners meeting. But obviously in today's environment, that's very difficult to do. So you need to be a little bit more creative in how you engage owners in making decisions. And in some cases, because you need safety comes first, boards do need to make some very difficult decisions. We're also advising boards to make sure they have good technology in place. Obviously business still needs to go on. We still need to make sure you can pay invoices, collect common expenses. Can you pay bills electronically? Do you really want to be dealing with checks? Can somebody electronically transfer you their common expenses? Can you electronically pay your vendors? Really looking at enhancing things as we go forward and changing the way we do business. And we strongly recommend that you engage your team of professionals. Boards and managers should not feel alone in making these decisions. Use the team members that you have on hand. So if we look at a couple of topics to consider, obviously your operating budget. We've got a lot of boards right now that are going through the process of updating their budget and working out what their costs are going to be for next year. So, does the community require more cleaning, more hours of housekeeping, more chemicals, more hand sanitizer? These are new costs that need to be reflected. We've certainly done a tally on the amount of chemicals that the communities we manage have spent, and it's quite astronomical. If you are looking at renovations, do we need to make any renovations to the common areas to better accommodate our residents and keep them safer? And finally, we're seeing with a lot more people at home, is utility use higher? Are we consuming more electricity if you're not sub-metered? Are we consuming more water because people are home? And does this mean that we have a higher demand on our HVAC system? So certainly it's something to look at there. Again, looking at implementing and changing policies as well as rules. Do we restrict visitors? Do we restrict non-essential work to the site? How many residents do you think we can allow in a elevator at a time? Do we even allow dog walkers to help people who may have difficulty going outside to walk their pets? How are we going to deal with the increase of parcels and food deliveries on a long-term basis? And finally, in terms of building infrastructure, a lot of boards have looked at, reducing the amount of airflow into the building to save on energy and save on electricity. But do we need more makeup air now that we have more people in the building more often using more of the air? And definitely this is a time where we feel the board should be implementing and exploring all green initiatives. There's a lot of options out there where you can install more energy efficient equipment and finance the costs. And right now there's it would definitely be the time to help reduce some of your operating costs, to offset some of the new costs that are coming. So we thought we'd give a couple of examples. Obviously the elevator is a really tricky one. How many residents can you safely fit in an elevator in a post-pandemic time? We recognize that the stairwells in most of the high-rise buildings are more designed for emergency exit, not necessarily daily traffic. So elevator use is still going to be predominantly the main method of access to and from each residence suite. This creates challenges. It's a lot harder to just pop out and grab a coffee now. I read a study this week where they were talking about how long it would take in the TD towers to move in for certain members of staff to arrive to work. It would take hours if you had to line up, and you could restrict the number of people into elevators, given that a lot of people come into the work at the same time, so they've had to space them out. In a condominium, we're still seeing people moving in and moving out. So how do we monopolize one elevator while still trying to restrict people coming in? So it's a really good idea, again, to talk these topics through with your professionals, with your management team, and reach out to professionals if you need more legal advice. How do we still undertake the necessary things of a building, such as the in-suite HVAC and the annual fire inspection? Obviously, HVAC is critically important because people are using it now more than ever because they're home more than they would normally be. And we're also looking at, obviously, the fire inspection system is very important because that's life safety. We're talking about changing the scope of work. So how often do the elevators need to be cleaned? How often do the elevator buttons need to be cleaned? And again, should we restrict visitors from using the elevators? The final thing I want to talk about is an example of we really have to look at some of the things that we do, and maybe in the future we have to do them differently. Here's an example of a scenario that occurred last week where a resident genuinely was told that they had come into contact with someone who had a confirmed case of COVID. So they did the right thing, they came back to their unit and they self-isolated. That particular resident's toilet just so happened to leak. It was leaking into the unit below. And of course, the unit owner below was very concerned that there was sanitary dripping down. Obviously, we've been told that COVID with the air particles can also transfer during the sanitary system. So when the plumber was called to say, look, can you go in and fix this? We think it's a gasket. Could you go and fix it? The plumber didn't feel comfortable going in. This person's self-isolating. They may have, they've been in contact during the 14 days. Plumber wanted to feel safe. So then what do we have to do? Well, then the manager then called a restoration company who was able to provide a team to come out in the full PPE gear to keep their employees safe. And they went in and they changed the work. And they were able to fully sanitize the suite after they were finished. But here's an example of what would normally be a simple exercise of maybe just changing a toilet gasket became a really complicated issue and at a significantly higher cost than it would have been otherwise. So again, the best practice for the future, really we're encouraging boards and managers to increase their level of communication, keep your owners informed of the decisions that you're making. We really feel for managers and boards at this time because you are needing to make tough and difficult decisions. Telling people on a 38-degree day that the pool is still closed is not fun. So we definitely advise making use of your industry professionals. When making decisions, safety should be paramount, particularly in your plans and policies that need to be implementation. And at the same time, you really need to make sure we give consideration to any residents with special needs. And understand that this could take some time. We don't know, the end is not in sight, so we're really looking at exercising some best practices.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much to our incredible panelists. Very, very, very insightful. I'm sure we could go on days talking about this topic. There's just so much to cover, but I think you guys covered a lot of very important topics, and we'll get to some questions now. We'll try and squeeze in as many questions as possible. We might run a little bit past 5, but we're going to try and have a hard stop by 5:05, 5:10, but we'll see how the questions are going. The first question is for Deborah. How do I know I am safe if someone has been exposed and or in contact with someone who has had COVID-19 or is asymptomatic? Is there a waiver form we could mandate for them to sign? I think you briefly touched upon this a little bit, but do you want to elaborate?
Sure. I mean, you know, there's always a legal answer and a practical answer. And practically, how do you know that you're safe? You can't. And the reason you can't is because we know that with this virus, insidious as it is, many people are asymptomatic. I can tell you about a personal circumstance. One of my family members, who is in her 80s, was diagnosed with COVID-19, and she had it over 3 weeks. And in her 80s, that's certainly a risk factor. She displayed not one symptom, not fever, not coughing, no shortness of breath, nothing. So many people are asymptomatic. We don't understand why. The medical professionals don't understand why. And so you can never really know if you are around somebody who has COVID-19, which is, of course, why we're talking about physical distancing and mandatory masks and all those things. With respect to waivers, I think that they make sense in circumstances where you're dealing with amenities. Will they be enforceable at the end of the day? As I say, it depends on the wording of the waiver and the circumstances. I don't think it's a bad thing to implement, but of course, it's not going to ensure that you don't get exposed. The best thing to do is to bear down on those physical distancing measures, masks, consider a rule with respect to masks, and just encourage people to continue washing their hands and all of those other public health safety measures. Hopefully that was responsive.
Wonderful, wonderful. Going back to the story that Julian was saying about the leaky toilet, an attendee wants to know who paid for the leaky toilet.
So again, if you, as a manager, if you are, encouraging a situation like this, the owner who had the leaky toilet was given a number of options. You obviously turn your water off. If you feel comfortable, because in this particular instance, the unit owner was responsible for the toilet. This wasn't a corporation related matter. However, the dripping of the toilet down below was the condominium's duty in accordance with their declaration and their bylaw to handle that damage. So the unit owner was given a quote for the cost to undertake the repair that needed to be done. And so it was the corporation did pay for the damage, but it was then charged back to the resident who'd been provided with a quote, so the resident knew what the cost was going to be. And I think it was probably 3 to 4 times the regular cost, just due to the fact that a different level of company came in. But as a result, the unit owner also got their suite cleaned because they had to go through and clean it all. So there was a benefit to the unit owner who did have to pay a little extra money for that service.
Wonderful. Another question for Julian. I would like to know, given that property management is considered an essential service, can a board of directors require that a manager be present on site when under normal pre-COVID-19 circumstances, the expectation was to have an on-site presence? If there was any previously an expectation of stated hours.
So yeah, obviously, there's a lot of condominiums out there that would have an on-site management office. Nicholas, I'm sure you have some as well, where previously, pre-COVID, there was an expectation that managers would go in for a certain number of hours a day. And then COVID occurred and a lot of people started working from home to minimize contact with others. Look, I think you have to have a really good relationship with your board. And Deborah, maybe you want to weigh in on the legal side of things. You would never, ever want to put a manager into a situation where they didn't feel safe. If we have managers that happen to be in a high-risk category, or they have family members that are in a high-risk category, just acting reasonably. This has nothing to do with condo management. This is just general good, being decent as human beings. We certainly wouldn't want to put anyone in a situation where they feel uncomfortable. I think where the question really comes in is, do you feel obligated? Is there an obligation to go in? If the board's saying, look, I need you to come in here and take care of this because these are tough times, these are difficult times, you could be encroaching a little bit on human rights. That being said, we're seeing that mask wearing in Toronto in public spaces is now mandatory. So does safety trump it? So maybe Deborah, maybe you want to weigh in a little on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely, Julian, thanks. So don't forget that workers, and a manager is a worker under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The corporation as a workplace has an obligation under Section 25 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act to take every reasonable, not extraordinary, but any reasonable precaution necessary for the protection of a worker. And if you look at the Ministry of Labor website when it comes to COVID-19, one of their very first directives in order to keep workers safe is what? If the worker can work from home, do that. So a worker is entitled to refuse unsafe work under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and the corporation has to make sure that the workplace is safe. So if there is any issue that the manager is not safe while attending on site, they could potentially refuse that work. And secondly, the corporation has to keep on putting into place all of those measures that will reduce any exposure to COVID-19. And if the manager can work from home, then that's what the Ministry of Labor tells us is the default. So there will be some circumstances where it's an emergency and they have to attend, but in the normal course, if it's not, I mean, look at what we're doing today. We're doing a webinar, and 4 months ago, I had no idea to do a webinar. So you can adapt so that everybody stays safe, and that's quite frankly the legal requirement, to only require that they attend the workplace if necessary.
Wonderful. There's another question here that I think I'll answer this one, even though I'm not a panelist. I am an expert with board meetings and AGMs and owners meetings. The question is, any comments on AGMs? Are condos gearing up for video AGMs in the fall? So towards the end of March, when we first sort of went into quarantine and lockdown, pretty much all meetings were more or less canceled or postponed, including AGMs and board meetings. So we saw most of, towards the end of March and most of April, very, very, very limited amount of meetings. Now we're seeing that switch pretty quickly. I think everybody is starting to realize that this is gonna go on for a little bit longer than most of us would like. And meetings have to get done. That's including AGMs. And even if the statute of limiting your get-togethers of 10 people or less, even if that's lifted and the government comes in and says, okay, you could hold meetings or conferences or whatever of upwards of 50 people, are residents really going to be comfortable sitting on top of each other at an AGM? So that's not the case right now. We're not really allowed to meet with that many people. So what we're seeing is most boards are opting for the virtual AGM. We handle those through our partner Get Quorum, so we could help you guys with that 100%. But our thought is, going into the future, for the next foreseeable future, even if things start to open up, we believe that most boards are going to want to have at least the option for people to attend virtually, even if it's safe to meet in person. This is going to linger. It's going to be in people's minds for a little bit. People are going to be hesitant to get together and meet in large groups in some semi-small rooms. So we really think that video AGMs as at least an option will be here for the long term. So there is the bylaw that, or there's a law that was mandated. It's 90 or 120 days after the Emergency Act is ended. You have to hold your AGM. You could do it virtually, even if it's not in your bylaw. I just read today that there is consideration of extending the emergency orders from the Ontario government into 2021. If that does happen, a lot of boards are going to be going far too long without an AGM if they're planning on waiting. So my advice is if you haven't done so already, start learning about the virtual AGM, seeing if it's a viable option for your board, because we strongly recommend people consider it. for the foreseeable future.
I will add, if I may as well, Noah, there's a few other things that you should consider when you're doing an AGM. If there is a timeline after the emergency orders are lifted and you have to hold an AGM within 90 days, you don't want to be one of the corporations that's scrambling to get the auditor at your AGM, to book the lawyer, to book the hall, wherever you're doing it, because if everyone's scrambling to book the same people on the same day, it's going to be a madhouse. So having the option is very prudent, but going a step further, your corporation might need to pass bylaws. You might have business that you need to conduct, and keeping it for 6 months, a year, the same board without even voting on subjects that require owners' approvals might put your corporation far behind, especially at properties where cash might be an issue and a borrowing bylaw might be required, or there's some major maintenance repair that needs to be done that requires owners to vote. So some of these complications might almost force your hand to try and use these solutions to hold your meetings virtually as opposed to waiting for them to be done physically.
Wonderful.
We've done a number of turnover meetings already virtually, and like this webinar, you could be attending your AGM right now. So it definitely is doable.
Beautiful. Next question for Nicholas. How can we protect, this is coming from a manager, how can we protect ourselves in the office if residents refuse to wear masks?
Well, I would sort of bounce that back to what Deborah just said. If the resident's refusing to wear the mask, you can always deny them the service. I'm sure you've seen some of the viral video that had come on just a couple of days ago at St. Joseph Hospital, where a lady was asked to wear a face mask and was denied a service. If you are uncomfortable working in a management office and someone is not going to respect that you're uncomfortable, I would simply not allow them into the office and not deal with them. At the end of the day, it's a workplace. You are there to perform a job, and there needs to be a mutual level of respect between the manager and the owner. Mediation you can really do for that. Either they respect your boundaries or they don't. And if an owner comes into your office and doesn't respect your boundaries, then you're going to have a nice conversation, and hopefully it is only a nice conversation. But that's not acceptable for someone to put you in an uncomfortable situation that your safety or your health could be a concern for you.
Okay, great. And one last question. It sort of ties into this, but I'm going to gear it towards Deborah, and I think it is an incredibly important question. It has to do with the staff of the building. And the question is, what measure is the province taking or expecting us to make, this is coming from a manager, to protect staff from any risks? Deborah, you want to take that one?
Sure. So the Ministry of Labor has tried to get out in front of this COVID-19 issue, and they've put a lot of inspectors into seats where previously the budgets had been a little thinner. They have a full, on their website, if you look at their website, they will have quite a lot of information about suggested steps in order to keep workers safe. A lot of them, of course, focus on the public health initiatives that you've seen through public health directives. As I mentioned earlier, the first and foremost directive is workers should work from home if possible. Sanitization and cleaning is a big one, ensuring that all high-touch tools and surfaces are regularly cleaned, and more so. The physical distancing is the big one, not just creating distance between people, but also barriers. So that's one of the things we've done in our office. For example, we've got plexiglass. I know that there are a number of condominium corporation lobbies that have done the same. They've erected barriers or some clear plexiglass. They've also required that employers reduce the number of passengers in elevators or workers in a spot. So if normally you're sitting at Carol's and you've got 2 or 3 in a confined space, you want to spread those out. Hand sanitizers, giving employees an opportunity to stagger their work hours so that they're not coming in if they have to present to work because they're essential. And many condominium workers will be essential, then they don't all come in at the same time. What about they work a later shift into the evening, or they come in super early in the morning? scheduling breaks at different times, reminding workers to stay home if they're sick. I know a number of employers are actually screening their workers as well on a daily basis at the start of their shift. Do you have the symptoms? Have you been exposed to anybody? And they require them to do that before they go into work. So those are some of the measures that the Ministry of Labor has suggested. And to my mind, they make a lot of sense.
Wonderful, wonderful. So just to wrap up here, I want to sincerely thank all the panelists that were joining us today. Julian, Deborah, Nicholas, you guys did a phenomenal job. Thank you so much for taking the time and helping to educate the industry. Again, after this webinar is done, all the attendees will be sent a quick 4-question survey. We just want to know how you guys found this, if you found it educational, if you found it useful. And if you did, we would love to start having these on a regular basis, maybe a monthly basis. And we'd be looking for topics that you guys would like us to cover. So again, thank you to the attendees who joined us. Thank you to the panelists. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks.